So what else does the Liberal Party do for England besides the Parliament Act? Another thing that they do is they set the foundations for a social welfare state. All right, and this starts basically the decade before World War One. And the whole point of this was to try to guarantee each citizen with a decent standard of living. Remember, we previously discussed how Germany sort of pioneered the social welfare programs. All right, now England's going to catch on. You're going to see eventually, but it's going to take a little while. The United States is going to also take on some social welfare programs, but what are the sort of programs that the liberals are going to support here? They're going to support the rights of unions to strike. Okay. They're also going to provide government insurance for people who are injured on the job. They're going to provide unemployment insurance and old age pensions. So these two things, how's the government going to be able to pay for these? Well, you might have guessed through taxes, right? And this is significant because people who supported conservatives traditionally, also the wealthy, are going to bear the brunt of that tax burden much more than the beneficiaries of these programs. So you can see how there might be kind of a divided political opinion about these social welfare programs. Other things are going to make school attendance compulsory or mandatory. One of the reasons why that is because they want to make sure that people are good citizens, that they're voting wisely once they come of age. Because of course now, as the electorate expands, they want to kind of prepare every citizen to be politically engaged. So, I already suggested this, but in order to fund these programs, in order to pay for education, right, that is now mandatory, and of course it's also free, to provide things like government insurance for the injured, old age pensions, and so on, it has to increase taxes, and those taxes are going to be increased for the wealthy in particular. All right, another thing that the liberals do, they are going to expand suffrage that much more, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how the Representation of the People Act affects women. But for now, the important thing to consider is that this kind of finishes the deal for all those previous reform acts, all right? This is going to establish universal manhood suffrage, finally, for men. So 1918, slightly after, basically the end of World War One, okay? So all men gain suffrage. Also, and again, we're going to elaborate on this in just a moment, women over 30 are also going to get the vote. And we'll talk about why that is right now. All right, so let's think about what kind of influences there are on Parliament's decision to extend the voting rights to women. All right, so first off, before we get to suffrage in particular, there's also just a general movement for women's rights in England, and this has been going on for a while. And at first, they were really targeting amendments to marriage laws, property laws, because they discriminated against females. All right, so like, for example, existing laws said that men could divorce their wives if their wives committed adultery, but women could not seek a divorce from their husbands on the same grounds. All right, the only way that they could get a divorce from their husband was if they proved that their husband physically abused them, was unnecessarily cruel to them, or they deserted them. All right, so basically it was more difficult for women to get a divorce, and they argued that that was not fair. All right, you're also going to see that that existing laws prohibited women from inheriting property, so they want to change to that. But by the 1890s, they're going to go even farther and realize that really the main way to kind of open up women's rights is by giving women the right to vote. So you're going to see this great proliferation of women's suffrage activists. Okay, some of that is because they believe that without having the right to vote, men have not and will continue to not do enough to protect women from exploitation and abuse. All right, and they also, and this is an interesting argument, they think that if women have influence in public affairs, that this might kind of balance out the masculine qualities that dominate politics. Maybe they'll have an interesting influence over things like imperialist policy. Maybe they will not be as jingoistic. Remember, again, jingoism advocates kind of chauvinist foreign policy. So it's a very interesting argument. All right, so who are the suffragettes? Most of them are coming from the middle class, Why is that? Well, first off, they are the most educated. They're kind of well versed already in feminist works, so they kind of have the education and training to get them involved. Also, like we discussed in some of our social conversations earlier in the year, if you're middle class, you're more likely to employ servants, and so this basically means that women can take time away from their household duties to become active in the suffragette movement. All right, you are going to see working class women and socialist women, uh, work towards suffrage as well, but they tend not to join up with middle class women, so they're going to work towards their goals independently. The major figures of the women's suffrage movement that you should be familiar with in England are these two. All right, let's start with the more moderate. Millicent Garrett Fawcett. Okay, what she does is she leads an organization called the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, or the NUWSS. Okay, and this is much more moderate. Again, they are putting pressure on Parliament. They're saying that Parliament should grant women the right to vote. All right. But Parliament ultimately does not give in to their demands, so maybe a more moderate approach in this instance is not very effective. All right, but at the same time, she does help the suffrage movement grow. A lot of people are attracted to this kind of middle of the road approach, just putting a lot of pressure on Parliament. She also is going to play a significant role in some national and international suffrage conferences, so really just gathering together a group of women that are in support of suffrage. And she certainly did make an impact because she was actually knighted in 1924. All right, but interestingly, it takes a much more militant approach in this instance to really get Parliament to budge. Okay, so Emmeline Pankhurst is the more militant suffragette that we should be familiar with. All right, so she's really frustrated because, here we are, Parliament is not giving women the right to vote, but she points out that in some Northern European countries like Finland and Norway, women are getting the right to vote. So, she sees England as a relatively progressive country in a lot of ways, but she is really, really infuriated with the fact that Parliament is not giving women the right to vote. Okay, so along with her daughter, Pankhurst founds a group called the Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU. And again, they're based on really militant principles. They undertake really violent activities, like they destroy railroad stations, they destroy works of art, they break store windows. A lot of times they will chain themselves to the front gates of Parliament, like really making a scene, kind of disrupting parliamentary activities. They go on hunger strikes, which results in them being force-fed and imprisoned. All right, sometimes they organize parades and demonstrations. So again, they're much more active. So yeah, you're going to see that a number of militant women were actually arrested for their activities. Again, like I just said, some go on hunger strikes when they're in prison and they're force-fed by authorities. All right. The public gets really upset at these force feedings, though, and so the Parliament eventually passes an act called the Cat and Mouse Act that will free starved female prisoners from jail, but once they regain their strength, they go right back into jail. So it's kind of a compromise, right, to just prevent these force feedings that the public is very upset about. Maybe the most notorious action by these militant suffragettes, and I didn't have room on this slide, so I put it on the next slide, was the suicide of Emily Davison. Right, what she does is she actually throws herself in front of the king's horse in a 1913 derby. So again, you kind of see not only are they, very violent in nature, they're actually willing to sacrifice themselves for the right to vote. All right, and so this ultimately puts the most pressure on Parliament, and we're going to see results actually occur here. I already mentioned the Representation of the People Act because one of the things it does is grant universal male suffrage. The other thing that it does is, and this is certainly a response to the women's suffrage movement, is it gives women over 30 the right to vote. Okay, and also note the date here, 1918. This is also because women were actively involved in supporting the British effort in World War I, so they're rewarded for that as well. Okay, this is very similar to the 19th Amendment in the United States, which happens also right after World War I, and it's kind of a reward for women getting so involved in the World War I effort here. Okay, and the final step in the process is 1928. You get women over, that should be 21, I don't know why it says 20 there, women over 21 are going to get the right to vote in the Reform Act. So this basically finishes the process, and again, we see one of the general themes with England in this section of the reading here is the expansion of democracy, no matter which political party is in power, interestingly. So, even under the Conservatives, you are going to see increased rights for the working class, for example. You're going to see the expanded vote. But arguably the Liberals do a lot more for expanding democracy than the Conservatives do. So next we're going to move on to Ireland. So last thing to discuss with Great Britain is the Irish question. Realize that, what to do with Ireland has been a really pressing and serious question for Great Britain for a long time now. Ireland was absorbed into the United Kingdom in 1801, and it was always subject to harsh rule by Great Britain, largely because the Irish were predominantly Catholic, so they resented being ruled by this Protestant nation. Another thing that happened was that the Irish were forced to pay tithes to the Church of Ireland, which was more or less the Church of England, just in Ireland. So it was a Protestant church, which the Irish really resented. So what you're going to see is starting in 1848, which not surprisingly is the time of so many other political upheavals throughout Europe. The Young Ireland movement is going to gain a lot of strength. So Young Ireland, you can think like Young Italy, which we already discussed, a very nationalistic, pro-Irish Home Rule organization, right? So Irish Home Rule, in other words, is the idea that the Irish rule themselves. They have their own parliament, right? They can have any sort of religious policies that they want, because they really, again, they're really resentful of being subject to British rule. They are exploited a lot of times for their agricultural resources. Eventually you're going to see that many Irish people ultimately decide to leave Ireland because of the way that they are treated, but a lot of times when they end up in the United States, they're not treated that much better, which is an issue for U.S. history. So anyway, so we already said earlier that William Gladstone actually did support Irish Home Rule, but he's not successful in getting it passed, all right? And one of the reasons why this is because the Ulster section of Ireland, which is this area here, which now is Northern Ireland, they oppose Irish Home Rule, all right? And one of the reasons why that is first off because most people that live in Ulster are Protestant, so that's one thing. Also, they want to be part of Great Britain because they are growing economically ever since the 1890s. So they actually resist home rule, and what the Ulsterites do is they raise a militia, they raise an army, 100,000 soldiers by 1913, and basically what these soldiers are trying to do is prevent home rule. All right, and the Ulsterites are actually supported by British public opinion as well. All right, but nonetheless, you're going to see that in 1914, on the eve of World War I, the Irish Home Rule Act is passed. All right, but it doesn't really work at first because, again, the Protestants in Ulster and Northern Ireland don't accept it. All right, so what Parliament decides to do is delay the implementation of the Home Rule Act because, again, 1914 is right when World War I is starting, and they really can't be bothered with this when there's so much else to deal with. Okay, so they defer the implementation of the Irish Home Rule Act until after World War I. But there's a problem for people who support independence. They want independence then. They don't want to wait until after World War I. So the response to that delay is the Easter Rebellion in 1916. So this is going to be a bunch of pro-independence Irish people who revolt against the delay of the Irish Home Rule Act. But the British troops are going to put them down, totally crush them. All right, but because of the defeat of the Easter Rebellion, you're going to see a continued push towards a Republican government in Ireland. They still really want their own home rule. So the result, in 1922, you are going to see Irish independence. However, Northern Ireland's going to remain part of the British Empire, all right? So hence this map here of Great Britain. We know now today, or hopefully we know now today, that Northern Ireland is actually not Ireland. It is part of Great Britain. And Ireland alone, the southern areas, the Catholic areas, gained their independence. So again, just like the general theme of this whole chapter, we see expanded democracy throughout Europe, right? And the Irish question, Irish Home Rule, is yet another example of that. Next time we're going to move on to the Austro-Hungarian Empire.